2NURFM 103.7. Just ahead of Easter, it's time to have a look at some of the things that are happening in the world of education. We do that with John Fischetti of the University of Newcastle. Mate, nice little break coming up for you in the next couple of days.
We get a couple of days to breathe. It's a good time of year.
All right, with I guess the first term out of the way, or basically out of the way, I guess a chance to look back on what we've learnt in school and I guess how we learn. What do you reckon? Of most of the students that are going through school, where they've learnt, they've kept in their brain everything that's gone in?
Well, it's true for young children, but it's also true for all of us, Mark. We actually don't remember much of anything. Like, I didn't remember to say good morning to you this morning. About
I thought you were just being rude.
80 to 90% of what we take in within 2 weeks is gone. And we don't remember, we forget. So it's a strange reality that we think we keep it in our heads. That's just human brains and the sort of primal nature of what we do. So most everything children have just learned in term one will be gone by the end of Easter holidays. It's pretty confronting, isn't it?
When you look at it like that, and it kind of makes sense, because when we look back at our own school days, I mean, we know that we spent, 6 or 7 hours every day, 5 days a week for 13 years more if you did some further education. And you're right, there's a few little things probably because of certain moments that we remember, but you're right, I think most of it we just forget. But what actually goes on there? Because we obviously are able to function once we get some stuff in there.
Sure, and we have Siri and Alexa and the other guys to help us out right now.
True.
It takes 7 to 21 times of repetition to actually remember something. And remembering isn't learning, but that practice does give us the opportunity to maybe remember when we need it, which we might call learning. Like if you actually remember the things that your mom taught you or your kindergarten teacher taught you. 7 to 21 times. Most teachers teach something by introducing it, let students practice, then there might be a quiz or there might be some celebration, then we move on. I just gave you 3 or 4. It takes 7 to 21. Challenge anybody to tell you their mobile number now, and most people don't have a clue. Now, you might say we don't need that, but that's an example of if you really needed to know it, you'd have to practice it multiple times. Very few educators do things 21 times, but footy coaches do, drama coaches do, music coaches do. They're practicing lots and lots. So the first thing is we got to practice, but it can't be the transactional kind of practice that most schools do every day, which is I talk, you listen, there'll be a quiz. Because only 5% of what we take in we actually remember within 2 weeks if we've learned it by listening. And how much of your education was actually listening to teachers talk?
That's a good point.
You don't remember, but most of it. 10% we get from reading. So you only remember 10% of what you've read. Now, the 10% convinces you've remembered it all. And the butler did it, by the way. You just didn't remember.
Exactly.
20% we get from audio-visual. So this notion of we'll show the movie, the teacher's excuse will roll in the movie, actually is almost 4 or 5 times better than listening to them talk. But it's 30% when you see a demonstration, like the science teacher that did the lab demo, but you didn't get to do it. So most of it's gone. 50% if there's in a group discussion, if it's in the right group. 75% when you get to practice it, so you do the lab. But the actual best way to remember things long term is after you might have done some introduction and maybe some reading and maybe that video, is when you teach it to someone else. So if I was going to learn your soundboard here, I can watch you do it. I can watch the YouTube video of it. If you, and we're not on air so we don't end up ruining it for our listeners, you let me practice it. We only really learn when we get to practice, and we teach someone else from that practice. That's the censure that most schools haven't really operationalized at this point.
I think that makes a hell of a lot of sense, because you're right, we do forget a lot of gear. It just goes in and goes out, but our memory makes us think that we've learned a lot because we've got that 10 or 15% in there. Oh, I know some
completely
facts.
Helpless.
So I guess how do we, because I guess every subject doesn't really have that practical application that we can do that. So yes, I guess in science and maybe some of the art type things that is a thing, but how do we translate that into some of the other subjects that are just more book learning?
I'm just going to give you a simple one just because of time this morning. In English class, about year 8, we might learn from Shakespearean literature who's the protagonist and who's an antagonist. And we're just learning terms. I'm at the lowest level of knowledge, just remembering terms. Protagonist, basically a good guy. The arc of most stories have good guys in it. They also have bad guys. Some of them are bad gals, but I'm just using that generically. So a protagonist is a good guy, and usually most stories have them. The best literature, the best series on Netflix, you can tell me who the protagonist is. When there isn't one, it's either very cryptic, or you watched it late at night and couldn't figure it out, or it's not very good. So now I want Mark to explain to Graham in the other studio what's a protagonist? What's an antagonist? By turning it on its edge and just having that interaction, you'll never forget it. And we don't get to that level most because we kind of cram in so much learning. We keep going and going and going and covering as opposed to go a little bit deeper. So that's the message of the day. We got to get Mark and Graham teaching each other some stuff.
Possibly. Is it also maybe that actually sort of sharpens our brain up a little bit? Like if there's this consistent, bland is the wrong word, but this consistent level of learning that this happens, nothing, our brain does switch off, thus we only can't take the 10% in. But all of a sudden you tell me something and now I want you to tell somebody else. There's kind of that spike in our brain. Oh, I really need to have paid attention what John's telling me so I can pass it on.
And if for some kids they struggle with this, have a kid who's really good at soccer explain the offside rule to someone who doesn't have a clue. And all of a sudden, that kid will be a better teacher as a result. He'll understand it better, but that other person then has to explain it to someone else. Because that's still the most confusing rule in sport. So this can translate to almost anything else. Don't be so transactional in our learning. Put people in charge of explaining it their way. And actually then kids can teach each other with the teacher's supervision.
Yeah, explaining a sport to someone that you love to somebody that doesn't know about it, that can be very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, have a great Easter. John Fischetti from the
Thanks,
University
Mark.
of Newcastle. Appreciate your time.
2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.